So hi there, Clayton Childress.
Yes.
Yes, sociology professor at the University of Toronto. So, my first question for you is, what's like a brief, give me a brief like academic history or history of ideas, like what got you into sociology, what really has, moved your, I don't know, career choices or academic choices over the years, and what do you find really interesting today? Like, how did that shape you? Yeah.
Sure. So 3 questions in that one question. The brief academic history is I originally took a sociology class because my mom said I would like it. I'd never heard of sociology before. I got to undergraduate. And at that time, so my professor was at Vassar College, Pinar Batur. And I think like many first-year sociology students, we started out with C-right meals and troubles and issues, and I was going through, so it's a personal story, I was going through, my father had recently passed away, he was a Vietnam veteran, and that felt very isolating, and I felt like very alone, and it was actually sociology that kind of brought me back a little bit, right, where, right, because in the sociological imagination, C-right meals gives this example of war. Right, so I was struggling with having a veteran father who had recently died. So sociology, in some bizarre way, could actually explain how what I felt was a very isolating personal trouble was actually a public issue, and that there was a whole generation of people like me, and that was really powerful. I stayed in sociology not for those reasons, but because of the breadth of methods and theories and paradigms really within the discipline. At the time, sociology, I was at a liberal arts school, and sociology at the time felt like a liberal arts major within a liberal arts school. That there's so many different topics that could be covered, right? So for me, and then when I was applying to PhD programs, there was somebody I really, really wanted to work with, who had recently not fully left sociology, but had taken had created a media studies department. I knew I wanted to study media, and he had offered me a slot in that PhD program, and it was somebody I really, really wanted to work with. So the question was, do I want to work with this person and get a PhD in media studies, or would I rather not work with this person and get a PhD in sociology? And that was a really important moment for me, and I went back to thinking about what I loved about sociology. Number one, yeah, it can help explain some personal troubles I was struggling with, but also the freedom with which one gets by working in the discipline of sociology. So I decided to get my PhD in sociology just because I don't know if I always will study media, right? And I would say even increasingly in my life, or my academic life, my intellectual life, I have transitioned from thinking of media and the media industries not as a topic of study, but as a field site that I like to study when asking a different range of questions, right? Another part of the question, so that's the first part of the question. Yeah. I remember the third part of the question, so I'll do that, and then I'll ask you for the part that I left out. What I'm interested in and what I'm doing right now, everything kind of revolves around a couple key questions, right? How do people make decisions? How do people decide what they're going to do, right? In active moments of decision making, right? Most of the time, people aren't like actually weighing multiple options, right? Most of the time, we're just kind of on automatic pilot in most of the things we do. But in those moments when people actually have to make what are called hot cognitive decisions, what are the metrics by which people make those decisions, and how do people evaluate quality, right, in situations of fundamental uncertainty, right? Those are the things that really fascinate me and interest me. And media industries are a great field site to study those questions, right? Because media industries, so production, media industries on the production side, and on the reception side too, right? Media as a field site, any type of, cultural mediated form, be it a song or a novel or a YouTube video, or whatever it is, right? Or, you know, a post on Instagram or a tweet. There's always going to be uncertainty about quality, right? And they regularly, in the production context, or even in like the purchasing context, or the reading context, or the listening context, require some like high active cognitive decision making, right? Particularly, even more so in the industry context, when there's such a massive oversupply of things, right? So part of being in sociology means that, you know, right now, I'm really jazzed by studying media industries, but I can still ask those types of questions in tons of different settings, right? And it took a long time of thinking of myself as a person who studied media to realize what it was about media, number one, that I was actually studying, and number two, that I was actually interested in, right? What was the third part of the question, if you remember?
I think you, like, usually just, as long as I get, like, some story in there,
okay.
I think that pretty much covers things.
Yeah.
I don't know.
The only other story I can add to all this is, like, why media. And my whole life I've been interested, not my whole life, but, and I would also suggest you to be wary of recollective accounts, right? So I'm going to leave out all the other things I was interested in because they didn't lead to things, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a fireman, right? Right? If I was a fireman, I would tell you about how when I was a kid I always wanted to be a fireman.
Yeah.
Right? So because I'm a sociologist who studies media and decision making within media, I'm going to tell you a story about how I always loved that. But I think starting in 5th grade, the first thing I ever spent my own money on, really, was an Entertainment Weekly subscription. And Entertainment Weekly, and I can break from the norms of recollective storytelling. I did it because it came with a free New Wave CD, and I didn't really know what New Wave music was, but it was, like, so poppy. Alright, New Wave is, like, one of my favorite subgenres of pop, right? So I got it for the CD. But also, Entertainment Weekly at that time, Entertainment Weekly has become, it occupied this, it straddled a position between popular press magazine and like a trade press magazine. So Entertainment Weekly at that time, like there were no celebrities in Entertainment Weekly. It was all stories about producers and directors and screenwriters, right, and sound engineers, or it was tipped more heavily towards that type of stuff. Right, so I was always interested in the story of how these things got made, right? So you know, one of the most exciting moments of my childhood was so when DVDs from the transition from VHS to DVD. One of the ways, because remember the fixed cost has declined, right? It's cheaper to print a DVD and to ship a DVD, which is small, right, than a big clunky VHS tape, right? So one of the ways that they justified the increase in price was by including extras on the DVDs, and one of the extras they included were like director commentaries, right, where the director's talking about like, I made this decision for this reason, and I did this thing for this, and you wouldn't believe what happened here. So I went through this long period where I wasn't even interested in watching movies without the director commentary. I just wanted to hear the stories behind them, right? So that was this like watershed moment for me where it's like, oh, this, you know, this is the sugar, this is the thing I've been wanting. So I do think, and I had a range of, you know, I also really liked professional wrestling, right? But, which is its own media production in itself. But there was a long-standing interest in like these stories behind how media objects get made that I always liked. So it was through that I realized, you know, in retrospect, I can say, oh, I was interested, the DVD commentary, it's people explaining how they made decisions, right? So now I can say, like, maybe one day I'll shed off my media industry skin and retain my focus in decision-making and evaluation. But a more honest answer might be that, like, they've always kind of been intertwined, right? I could stick with media and give up and lose interest in decision making, right? You get down to the bottom and it's just all turtles, and you go, okay. Or vice versa. I don't know. We'll see.
Okay, so it would have been a very weird and different path for you to take on like behavioral economics as a sub-discipline, because when you talk about decision making and all these things, that's usually the first thing that comes to mind, even though it's usually in more of a formal lab setting as opposed to the in the So did you consider that as a...
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. It's a really perceptive question, too. I'm a sociologist. I was trained as a sociologist, right? So all of my degrees are in sociology. So with that comes sensory expectation for how things work, right? One of the things, and I'm not bashing behavioral econ at all, as a sociologist, decisions are made in contexts, right? And a lot of times I'm studying the contexts under which decisions are made. So a lab setting is a context, right? So I would say for some people, and the lab setting is really good for what some people study. Because it creates a lot of controls, right? It's a controlled experimental environment, and I would say that as a sociologist, the things I'm interested in are the things that in a lab setting are bracketed out, right? Like that context is really important, and that is purely a result of my sociological training, right? So for somebody of my generation, so the people what preceded me, right? Right, my mothers and fathers in the discipline, this kind of old way of doing things was it's called the production of culture perspective, right? Which still, as a animating framework, I think still inspires a lot of work in sociology of culture. But people don't even really talk about it anymore. And the restrictions, we learned about this in class, nobody says oh, which of the 6 facets am I covering? People don't do that anymore, right? So it's more, it's a way to animate, it's a way of thinking, right? It's bringing organizational theory into the sociology of culture is really what it was doing in many ways. So one of the early goals of the production of culture perspective is we can figure out, we're going to start at the meso level at different industries, the radio industry, right, and the book publishing industry, and see how things work in this different industry, and then once we have this accounting device and have accounted for the way things and all, then we can build back up into grand theory, right? So this is the context in which I was raised, so that would make me say, well, a lab setting isn't going to tell us anything about how decisions are made in the radio industry versus the book publishing industry, right? Because the questions you're asking want to bracket out the very difference between the radio industry and the book publishing industry, and that's actually the thing I care about. Does that make sense? And I think the language of decision making, it should, for I think most people, it signals behavioral econ, it signals psych, it signals business schools, right? So I think most sociologists probably wouldn't use that language, but they mean the same thing. We do study that, right? So most culture people, right, when they're talking about decision making, they're saying the relationship between culture and action, right? The relationship between... So we sociologists call it the relationship between cognition and action. But it means decision-making. And, I think also atypical is most sociologists, many sociologists, I should say, right here, right now, at this place and time, think there is a weak relationship, for the most part, between culture and action. Right? That's like the Swidler stance on things, right? During settled times, in day-to-day life, here's another good example, people... most explanations for action, most cultural explanations for actions are just post hoc justifications, right? So that's even yet another reason why I wouldn't want to do something in a lab, or I wouldn't just want to interview people, right? Because one of the things I learned in my field site, so I spent 6 months doing an organizational ethnography of a book publishing house, while also conducting a bunch of interviews, is, why people say they do things can be very different from what they're actually doing in practice. Right, so one of my papers is about how acquisition editors, who are the people who decide which books to publish in publishing houses, use BookScan, which is this data service where you can look up books and how many copies they've sold. Right, publishers have only known how many copies of books they didn't publish have sold since 2002 in North America. Right? This is a relatively recent phenomenon. That's terrifying in itself. Right? So if you ask people, how do you use BookScan? What they'll tell you is, oh, well, you know, I try to find, like, comp titles is what they're called. Similar titles to see how well they sold, to try to get a read on how well this thing is going to sell, right? In practice, right, and on the ground, in the publishing house, across publishing houses, that's not true. That's fundamentally untrue, right? People decide if they want to publish a book or not, and then go troll through BookScan looking for similar books that tell the story that they need to tell about which book they want to publish, right? The data is a post hoc justification, right? And for what I'm interested in a lab setting, you would never get to that truth of what people are doing, right? You know, so there's a funny story with that element, with what ended up being in that paper, right? Because I would ask people, how do you decide what books to publish? And you say, oh, well, you do this, you have to look at the numbers too. And then I was also conducting field work, and I would see the way that people were quote-unquote looking at the numbers. And in my interviews from that point forward, people say, oh, well, you know, you want to see how well the author sold, you want to see this. I would say, oh, well, you know, in my field work, I saw this thing happening. And people would be like, okay, you got me. Yeah, okay. Right? Right, so this is a incredibly long-winded way to say that context matters. And that for me and what I study, setting and context really, really matter. All right, that's the juice.
Cool. Yeah, context matters. Yeah, because I think usually when people think of like doing sociology period, they're not necessarily concerned with decision-making in action. Yeah, the language isn't always used there. Yeah. And I find it very interesting in how it comes out in your research and this stuff. So to branch off to something sort of different, what are some of the really interesting sort of findings or things you've come across, decisions being made, that, I don't know, have given a lot of like value or interest to your, you know, personal research or your personal learnings or whatnot?
You know, so I should say that, so I study both the production and the reception of mediated culture, right? So I'll give you an annoying answer first. What are the interesting things that I have done in my research is not for me to say, right? Yeah. You know, so I think that is really, you know, so I preface by saying, here's the things about my research that I find interesting. And, you know, part of producing any, if I write a paper, I'm incredibly lucky if more than a handful of people find anything interesting about it, right? So I don't produce work under the expectation that people find what I find interesting about it. I throw it out in the world and hope anybody will care, right?
Yeah.
You know, and part of the academic endeavor is most work that most people produce most of the time is redundant, right? So when I say like, hey, book publishers are doing this funny thing, that's within the context of people in the film industry also do that funny thing, and this person has studied that, right? And people in the music industry also do that funny thing, and hopefully over time, like, those funny things like seem less strange, right? So what do I think is interesting is like, well, it's a very limited thing, right? So I think that's like an interesting finding. You know, so right now I'm working on a book project, which is about the relationship between creation, production, and reception in media industries. And that's part of a larger project of following a single media object, following a novel through the creative process engaged in by an author, through the production process engaged in by a publishing house, promotion, distribution, right, through like reviewers and bookstores, and into 21 book groups across the United States. So that is what I was doing before we started talking. It's what I'm going to be doing after we started talking, is working on that book. I hope that that book is interesting and important, because in sociology, for a bunch of reasons, really starting in the early 1970s, the people who studied production and the people who studied reception stopped talking to each other. Right? The study of production and the study of reception largely split off. There's a couple exceptions here, right? Pierre Bourdieu is an exception, Wendy Griswold is an exception, but overall the story is that those people decided that they were doing different things, right? And over time, they grew to be doing different things. So one of the things that I'm arguing for in this work is that the decision to divorce production studies from reception studies in that historical moment made a lot of sense, right? But in this historical moment is kind of anachronistic, right? And that all the good reasons why we as sociologists should have done that back then don't really exist anymore. All the threats and all the boogeymen that cause people to do that aren't threats and boogeymen anymore. So I think if people find my work interesting, and that's up to them, that is what I hope they would find interesting in my work, right? Is trying to tease out a way to think of production and reception, and I would add creation too as its own independent process. Semi-independent process, because it's both independent and dependent, I would argue, as worthy of studying as, parts of a larger system, right? So I would say the current state of the field is we have people who study production and production context, we have people who study reception and reception contexts, and we have people who, study the exchange, right? But for the most part, the people who study the transition from production to reception don't actually follow things beyond once they make it into a consumer's hands. They don't actually study what happens after somebody takes a thing home, and they don't study what happens to the thing before it got passed to somebody, right? So it's still, I'm really trying to figure out a way, I'll leave this an open-ended question, if we gain anything from studying the full circuit. Right?
Okay.
I think we do, but that's ultimately not up for me to decide.
Okay, so you're sort of making the argument that it would be really valuable to get a bigger picture view of the process.
Yeah,
okay.
So through a micro level case study, right? Mm-hmm. Through a case study, through this one object, right? With a bunch of different methods, we can build up, I would argue, into 3 fields, right? That cultural creation, for things like books, this is different for things like advertising. Mm-hmm. For things like books, the writing of novels doesn't really happen in industries that much, right? It happens off in this pre-industry world where authors hang out with each other and talk to each other and have like writing groups, right? And they make a living through teaching an MFA program where they're independently wealthy, right? Mm-hmm. Or all these other things. So there is this whole field of creation that happens before industries. Okay. And that field, to exist, it needs producers and distributors, and it needs readers, right? So it is interdependent, right, with the field of production and the field of reception. Right? The field of production. If there's nobody to write books and nobody to read books, you're not going to be a field of production for books, right? So these 3 things are very interdependent, right? But they also, at their core, function kind of independently, right? So power relations, or the logic by which these fields are organized, right? And how people are positioned in them and the hierarchies that exist with them are independent of each other also. Right? So you as a reader probably don't know most readers don't know the implicit hierarchies between publishers, right? And probably don't know. They know they love books, right? But they don't know who's ascendant, right? Who's in decline, who everybody says they respect, but nobody actually respects, right? You just know that, like, out of the other end, books come, right? Mm-hmm. So the book publishing industry has its own thing going on. It needs readers, and readers need publishers. Some people would disagree with me about that. I call those people wrong, but I think publishers are still valid and still matter. But all right, so there's an independence And there's also a core kind of interdependence, right? So I think that's a good way to think about it. And cultural objects, like, so how does something get from the field of authorial creation into the field of production? There's actually boundary spanners who sit at either sides of those fields and translate what these things are, right? So we refer to this as pitching a project, right? So things are literally pitched from one field to another, right? So let's say that I'm a screenwriter, and I talk to other screenwriters, and they're like, "Oh, you do this. This is great. You know, this is really art, right? This isn't crap. This is art, right?" And you label and define art, but when you pitch it, you have a really different conversation than you do with your screenwriter buddies. You are translating the thing you did into a language that a suit can understand, right? And that's what a reviewer is doing with a thing too, right? It's translating what this thing is and how it makes sense in a production context for readers who actually, for the most part, or for viewers, don't care at all about the production context, right? They want it translated for the context they understand. Right? So that's why, like, professional film reviewers say, like, hey, this is where this film fits within this film history. Right? Mm-hmm. In the production context, film history doesn't come up that much. Right? Beyond, like, rough genre designations. Right? Film history is, like, code word for audience. Right? Market share. Right? Film history doesn't exist beyond market share. Where reviewers don't say, like, hey, people of this market share. Right, that's not really what they're doing. Right, they're saying like this. They're making a evaluative statement of like this is how this is good or bad within, this subgenre of movies, which it could be a code word for market share. But like they're making an evaluation, right, and they're also kind of explaining what this thing is, right, in a way that isn't about just market share. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Do you think the processes and things you're studying would be applicable or interesting to the average person in some sense? Like, for instance, could understanding these hierarchies or, pitching between fields, I also really like that sort of, pitching and field metaphor jammed in there.
Uh-huh.
Could that help, I don't know, the consumer understand, the average books they want to read? Do you have any ideas in that area? Is there any research in that area already?
Yeah, in most, for the most part, we don't. So So there's two parts to that question. The first part is like, would consumers want to know? I would say, so there's a market niche for everything. I would say for the most part, no. Going back to the post hoc justification thing. Mm-hmm. Let's say you hear a song you really like. Maybe you don't care why you really like it, and it just really connects with you. Mm-hmm. Right? And then you have an obnoxious friend who goes like, but why do you like it? I don't like it. And you go, oh crap. For this reason, or this, I don't know. Like, will something stick? I don't know, I just like it, leave me alone. Right? So I think for most people, I study entertainment, right? So I think for a lot of people, maybe they don't care beyond the fact that it's entertainment, right? For a lot of people, justifiably, there's no judgment in this, and this is true for me as well a lot of the time. I like the things I like because it's a break from things I don't like and things that like are really taxing intellectually, right? Mm-hmm. So I have like shows I watch and I like them because they require no thought at all. I don't care why I like them. It's totally not interesting to me. The whole point is not to think, right? And that's totally legitimate, right? People are allowed breaks. Mm-hmm. So I think for a lot of people, they don't care. I think also kind of wrapped up in your question is like, could your research like improve our algorithms? I don't think so. Will algorithms improve? Yes. But, I think academics and sociologists in particular are particularly poor people to do that because how to monetize the stuff we're studying is just like not something that we're generally interested in. Right? I can't speak for everybody, but like what are the like monetization applications of the things I study? My sense is that for some of my respondents, and in the industries I study, they both want to believe that people like me can solve their problems, right? They want to believe, and I don't think I can, nor do I think I'm that interested, right? I think consumers do a really good job, for the most part, of connecting and finding things that they find entertaining and enjoy, right? Through their own social networks, right? Mm-hmm. I think people are also really good. People say that humans are really bad at judging sunk costs and commit sunk cost fallacies all the time, right? Mm-hmm. For entertainment, I think people pretty rarely commit sunk cost fallacies. Mm-hmm. Right? Most of the time people say you know what? I don't like this anymore, so I'm just going to stop now. Right? People there's not, I would guess, it's not even a hypothesis, just a guess, there's not a lot of people who are watching season 3 of House of Cards who have hated the last season and a half of House of Cards, right? It's entertainment, so people defect, right? So I think the costs are, costs in terms of time are relatively low. I say this as a defector from House of Cards. I gave it a couple more episodes, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then just stopped, and that's fine. I found other stuff that I like. So I don't think my research helps people. I don't think my research helps businesses, and I don't think people need that much help in this regard. I think we're doing okay.
Okay. Yeah, the entertainment industry is not going to crash without us knowing the meta realities of post hoc justifications.
Yeah, that's fine. I think one of the things is, for better or for worse, my research is kind of low stakes, right? I can do that. If that was a conscious decision on my part too. Mm-hmm. I wasn't always studying things. Let me rephrase that. If I am wrong in terms of real world effects, it's really without that much consequence, right? And it takes an incredible amount of privilege to make the conscious decision to study things without much consequence, right? Let's preface with that. It takes an incredible amount of privilege to study things without any real world consequence, just because you think the ideas are interesting, right? I think it's also that was a personal decision I had to make. I did spend time much earlier in my career, studying things where I think for me personally, professionally, and politically, the stakes were really, really, really high, right? And I just wasn't built for it, right? For whatever reason, it's I cared too deeply to do good work, and I couldn't deal with the rejection because, I can deal with rejection on intellectual grounds, but it was no, you were rejecting this thing that matters in every facet of my life, right? So part of the academic project is, the greatest academic of all time maybe, only gets rejected 80% of the time, right? So just as a self-preservation device, studying something I find really interesting, but at the end of the day, this is a weakness on my part, and a weakness, one has to be privileged enough to be this weak, right? So I acknowledge that, but it is a personal decision I've made, So I would say, no, I won't actually say that outright until,
Cool. Yeah, do you have any other comments, questions, things you want to talk about?
I think it's important too. I want to talk about teaching.
Good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think teaching, when I say my work is low stakes, I think, the way I make up for that is in teaching. I hope the way I make up, so, like, declarative statements, about, like, oh, this is a messed up system, right? Mm-hmm. So part of my work is understanding why things don't work, right? So there is that implicit sociological questioning of how things work and how things don't work, right? How things could be improved, right? So, in talking about the creation, production, and reception process, there are things that drop out along the way and drop out for unjust reasons. That's part of the story too. But I would say, for the most part, that comes out in my teaching, probably more so than it does in my research, at least at this point in my career. It's a conscious decision too. I think for a lot of us, so I'll talk to you as somebody who's like completing your undergraduate education. I think sometimes undergraduates can be surprised by how much our research is actually animating our teaching, right? And that we are in real time in the classroom working out ideas and figuring them out. And I think that's been kind of a surprise for me too. So like in working on this book project, the language, a lot of the language has come directly from teaching and from class. Right? Because teaching in this way is like a first pass on how do I, like, what are the words with which I can most easily describe this thing I'm trying to get at. So I would say it's been a real eye-opener with this book project of how much of this book is driven by teaching and like what's happening in class. Right? So I think sometimes, I think sometimes undergraduates think that everything we're saying is definitive and everything we're saying is fact, and a lot of times it's works in progress, right? I think a really good story with this is, I'll end on a fun story, okay? Howard Becker, who wrote Art Worlds, it's like wonderful scholar, wonderful book. That book, I'll tell you a production story. We're going to end on a production story that animates that point, so everything wraps up together, right? So Howard Becker was a professor at Chicago and was on a sabbatical at Stanford. And Stanford had this program. Basically, the way the Stanford Library worked is you could just call it, this a long time ago, you could call it the library, and they would like bring to your office any books you wanted. So Howard Becker didn't know what he wanted to do, so he just like read really widely. Right? And then for a bunch of reasons I won't go into in Chicago, he was asked to teach this class on like arts and like arts organizations, kind of, right? So where did Art Worlds come from? If you read Art Worlds, he has like all these awesome random examples, which came out of just reading widely in his office at Stanford, right? Reading autobiographies and reading memoirs. Right, and just reading about different musicians, right, and different artists, just out of his own curiosity. And then each chapter of Art Worlds was one day of class, in the class he ended up teaching, right? So each chapter of Art Worlds is actually a day of class, and he worked out, so on his sabbatical, he just read a bunch of stuff, right? And then he had to go back and teach this class, and he never tried it before. And he took all that stuff that was floating around in his head and put it into thematic areas and kind of test drove those in class. And it ended up producing, through the teaching process and the research process, independently fused together, ended up producing one of the most influential books in the sociology of culture in the last 40 years. Right? So if I have anything else to say, I would say I think your professors care about teaching maybe sometimes more than they're given credit for, and I also think they get much more out of teaching than sometimes they even realize, and definitely more than they're given credit for.
Cool.
Ta-da!
Ta-da!
That's it.
Yeah, that answers the last question I normally ask anyway, which would be what is your 30-second speech to the world? Oh. But yeah, I think that pretty much covers it already. Thank you very much,
Awesome.
Clayton, for that cool talk.
No problem, Colin.
And then hit the button.